Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a silence that falls before the end of the world, not the comfortable silence of a still night, not the hushed peace of empty space. This is something else entirely, a silence that presses down on the mind like a thumb on glass, that smothers thought and memory and prayer. Psychers feel it first. They wake screaming, their gifts gone dark, replaced by something vast and incomprehensible pressing against the inside of their skulls. Astropaths lose their voices mid-sentence. Navigators go blind to the warp. Communication with neighboring star systems simply stops, as though the galaxy itself has drawn a breath and forgotten to let it out. And then they arrive, from beyond the edge of the known galaxy, from the lightless void between island universes, from a place so remote that even the ancient Eldari have no name for it. Whilst they come, not in ships forged from metal, not with weapons hammered in forge worlds or grown in manufactorums, they come as living things, mountains of chitin and sinew, and biological hunger, shaped over billions of years into the galaxy's most perfect killing machine. They come because something drew them here. They come because they are starving. They come because they have always been coming, long before any human eye looked up at the stars and wondered what lived among them. They are the Tyranids, and this is their history. Part 1. The nature of the Great Devourer. Before we can understand what the Tyranids have done to the galaxy, we have to understand what they are. Because the temptation, when you first encounter them in the lore, is to think of them the way you might think of any other army in Warhammer 40,000. All organized, but ultimately just another faction with goals and territory and politics. That is a deeply wrong way to think about them. The Tyranids are not an empire. They are not a civilization. They are not even really a species in any conventional sense. They are, as the scholars of the Ordo Xenos have come to describe them, with a kind of awestruck dread, the Great Devourer. A force of consumption so total, so relentless, and so utterly without purpose beyond feeding itself that calling it an enemy almost seems too small a word. Enemies want things. Enemies can be negotiated with, or at least understood. The Tyranids want only one thing, and that thing is everything you are made of. Let's start with the basics of what a Tyranid hive fleet actually is, which is because the scale of it is genuinely staggering in a way that can be easy to breeze past. A hive fleet is not a fleet in any sense you would recognize. It is not warships carrying soldiers. It is a living organism. Every component, from the largest bioship larger than any Imperial vessel ever built, down to the smallest ripper swarm crawling through the ruins of a devoured city, is a biological component of a single body. The hive ships themselves are creatures, organisms grown and evolved over millions of years, specifically to travel the void between stars. They do not use warp drives. They do not navigate through the roiling madness of the Imperium. Instead, they manipulate gravity itself, using specialized organs that essentially fold space around them to achieve speeds that have no right to be possible for living things. Well, this is one of the most quietly terrifying facts about the Tyranids, and it tends to get overlooked. The warp, that screaming dimension of emotion and chaos that underpins all of reality, means nothing to them. The phenomenon that every other spacefaring civilization in the galaxy depends on, fears, or desperately tries to control simply does not apply. They are not touched by it. They do not need it. They sail through real space directly, and when they arrive, they bring with them something that affects the warp profoundly, but entirely on their own terms. That something is the shadow in the warp. Imagine you are on a planet somewhere on the edge of Imperial space. You wake one morning and something feels wrong, though you cannot say exactly what. There is a pressure behind your eyes that was not there the night before. But your neighbors seem quieter than usual, irritable, frightened. The local astropath has not been seen since yesterday. The birds have stopped singing, animals clustered together in unusual places, twitching with some primal unease they cannot name. Over the next few hours, that pressure grows. For anyone with even a trace of psychic sensitivity, it becomes unbearable. A cacophony of alien thought pressing in from every direction at once. the psychic weight of something impossibly vast, bearing down on the thin membrane of reality. For psychers, it is often fatal. The mind reaches out instinctively, seeks connection with the broader currents of the warp as it always has, and finds instead a wall of something that cannot be described in human language, a billion alien consciousnesses, perfectly unified, pressing outward, the shadow in the warp. But by the time you feel that shadow, the hive fleet is often already close enough that escape is impossible. That is by design. The shadow severs astropathic communication, making it impossible to call for help. It disrupts warp travel, meaning anyone trying to flee in a starship risks being hurled back into real space or lost forever in the void. It isolates the target completely, and then, with the world utterly alone and its defenders beginning to slide into the kind of primal, incoherent panic that the Tyranid's psychic presence induces, the first creatures arrive. The Tyranid invasion of a world follows a process so refined by millions of years of practice that it has its own terrible elegance. It begins long before the main fleet arrives. The hive mind, that vast collective intelligence that binds every single Tyranid creature across the whole fleet into a single unified organism, sends ahead its vanguard creatures. These are things like lictors, those terrifying mantis-like hunters that can make themselves nearly invisible, capable of moving through an entire hive city without being detected, observing defenses, leaving pheromone trails for the swarms to follow, and sowing fear. There are genostealers, perhaps the most famous of the Tyranid advanced organisms, who arrive sometimes centuries ahead of their parent fleet, infiltrating populations, reproducing by implanting their genetic material into unwilling hosts, creating multi-generational cults of infected humans who do not even know they are no longer entirely human, or rip a swarm seeded in advance to devour organic matter and transmit data back to the hive mind. All of it intelligence gathering, preparation, softening the target before the hammer falls. At the heart of the hive fleet, protected deep within the most heavily armored bioships, live the Norn Queens. These are, in many ways, the most important organisms in a Tyranid fleet, though calling them commanders would be an oversimplification. Norn Queens are enormous biological factories, gargantuan creatures whose purpose is reproduction and evolution. They consume the genetic material harvested from every world the fleet devours, every creature defeated, every civilization consumed. Every soldier whose genes the hive mind finds useful gets fed into the vast biological machinery of the Norn Queens, broken down, analyzed, and incorporated. The new strains of Tyranid organisms are grown to counter defenses the fleet has encountered. If the last prey world had beings with powerful psychic abilities, the Norn Queens will birth new Tyranid organisms with better resistance to psychic attack. If the defenders used fast-moving vehicles, the new vanguard will include organisms evolved specifically to disable them. The Tyranids do not just adapt, they do so at a speed that defies belief, sometimes within the span of a single planetary campaign. This is what makes them categorically different from every other threat the Imperium of man has ever faced. Chaos is ancient and terrible, but it has weaknesses, patterns, things you can study and predict. Kassuits. Orcs love to fight, and will sometimes fight each other as readily as they fight you. The Eldari act in service of prophecy and cosmic self-interest. Even the Necrons, those sleepless, undying machines, operate according to a logic you can at least map. The Tyranids have no such weaknesses. Every battle they fight makes them stronger and more perfectly suited to fighting that kind of battle again. Every defeat teaches the hive mind something that gets incorporated into the next generation of organisms. To hurt them is, in the long run, to help them. And then there is the question of what they actually want, which is where the true horror lives, quietly, underneath all the impressive statistics about bioships and synapse creatures and genetic adaptability. The Tyranids want biomass. That is it. That is the whole of their ambition. Every creature on every world they have ever touched, every ecosystem, every civilization, Every atmosphere, every ocean, every single organic molecule is evaluated purely as raw material to be converted into more Tyranids and fuel for the endless migration. When a hive fleet finishes with a world, there is nothing left. Not ruins, not even dead soil. The planet is stripped down to bare rock, its atmosphere consumed, its oceans drunk, its very core picked over for whatever biological trace might remain. Then the Tyranids move on to the next world and do it again. Scholars of the Ordo Xenos, the branch of the Inquisition dedicated to studying alien threats, have spent centuries trying to determine where the Tyranids came from originally. The most widely accepted theory, supported by what fragmentary evidence exists, is that they originated outside the Milky Way galaxy entirely. They have migrated here, likely after consuming every accessible resource in their home region of the universe. Given that each of the major Tyranid hive fleets has approached from a different direction, it is possible they have devoured their way through multiple galaxies of the local group before arriving at ours. The scale of what that implies, the sheer number of civilizations that may have been consumed before we ever knew they existed, is not something the Imperial authorities generally discuss in public. Some knowledge is not stabilizing. The collective intelligence of all this, the vast psychic entity that links every Tyranid creature from the largest biotitan to the smallest organism, is called the hive mind. It is not a person, it is not a god. It has no name for itself and no concept of individuality whatsoever. What it is more like a weather system than a mind. A vast distributed intelligence that processes information from billions of simultaneous sources and directs the swarm with a purpose so clear and unified it can look at first glance almost like tactical genius, and in some ways it is. The hive mind does not feel fear. It does not grieve its losses. Every organism that dies in battle is just data, information about what works and what does not, which gets factored into the next evolutionary iteration. The hive mind does not care about any individual creature any more than your brain cares about an individual neuron. One important nuance: when the Swarm Lord appears on the battlefield, things change. The Swarm Lord is a unique bioform. Was a hive tyrant so perfectly crafted and so powerfully connected to the hive mind that it represents the closest thing to the hive mind's direct presence on a planet's surface? It has been killed and reborn multiple times across different conflicts, the hive mind simply growing a new one from stored genetic templates each time. The Swarm Lord remembers. It learns. It adapts between incarnations in a way most Tyranid organisms cannot. And when it appears, you know the hive mind is paying close attention. You know whatever happens next will be used to build something worse. But before any of this could be truly understood by the Imperium of man, before the full scope of what the Tyranids were could be comprehended by the scholars and soldiers and inquisitors who would spend their lives fighting them, there were the first warnings. Subtle, easy to misinterpret, and largely misinterpreted. And by the time the misunderstandings were corrected, the first worlds were already gone. Part 2, Before the Storm, Tiamat, Yemgal, and the Vanguard. Every great storm has a moment before it. A shift in pressure, a change in the wind that anyone paying close enough attention might notice. The arrival of the Tyranids in the Milky Way had its own version of this, a series of incidents scattered across centuries and different regions of space that, taken together, painted a picture that the Imperium was very slow to recognize. When that recognition finally came, it was catastrophically late. The oldest confirmed Tyranid presence in Imperial records is the Tiamat system, and it is unlike anything else in the history of the Great Devourer. Most hive fleets consume everything in their path, with an absolute thoroughness that leaves nothing behind. The Tiamat system is different. Encountered in the 35th millennium, more than 6,000 years before the events we will come to, the system contained worlds where something very strange was happening. Every world, every moon, every drifting rock with any organic content was teeming with interconnected life, but life that shared a common genetic ancestry across the entire system. The creatures here were all related to each other, evolved from the same biological source. linked in ways that seemed to defy the normal rules of ecology. The explorators of the Adeptus Mechanicus who investigated found something disturbing enough that they quarantined themselves rather than risk contaminating the wider Imperium. They survived for 162 hours before succumbing to the system's inhabitants. The system was fusion bombed multiple times over the following centuries in attempts to sterilize it, but nothing worked. Life kept returning. The system kept growing. By the time of the Great Tyranid invasions, Tiamat sat at the heart of what the Ordo Xenos would come to understand as a unique phenomenon. A Tyranid hive fleet that was not consuming its prey worlds and moving on. Instead, the primary world of Zeophoria was being actively transformed by the Tyranids who inhabited it. The surface of the planet was being reshaped at a biological level into some kind of enormous structure. What it was intended to do, what purpose this living biomechanical megastructure served in the larger plans of the hive mind, remained unknown and deeply unsettling to everyone who looked at it. Some have theorized it was a psychic resonator of some kind, a device to send a signal outward into the void to other hive fleets still approaching. Others have darker theories. None of them are comforting. What was clear was that Tiamat represented something outside the understood patterns of Tyranid behavior, and that unknowability was its own kind of terror. But it was the moons of Imgal that gave humanity its first direct encounter with the physical horror of what Tyranid vanguard organisms actually were. And this happened more than 200 years before Hive Fleet Behemoth arrived. The moons of Imgal, a handful of cold, unremarkable rocks orbiting a star of no particular significance. Imperial merchant vessels made a navigational stop there, and they found something. Creatures they had no category for, small by Tyranid standards, roughly human size but built on a body plan that had no equivalent in any catalogue of alien species the Imperium maintained. Genistela stock, though no one knew that word yet. They had the characteristic multi-limbed, chitinous armoured bodies, but the most unsettling feature was the face, or rather the thing where a face should have been. A writhing array of tentacles where a mouth and eyes might otherwise sit. They called them the Imgal Genistelas, named for the world where they were first found. The danger they represented became apparent quickly, and they were purged by elements of the Salamander's Space Marine chapter, one of those legacies of the first founding whose roots went all the way back to the earliest days of the Imperium. As the Salamanders cleansed Imgal's moons as thoroughly as they could, but the experience left questions that nobody had the framework to answer at the time. Where had these creatures come from? They did not match any known organism. They were clearly not native to those moons, which lacked the ecology to have produced them. Had they arrived on a ship? Were they escaped experiments? Nobody knew, and in the grinding priority queue of existential threats that the Imperium managed on any given day, a handful of dead alien organisms on a few unimportant moons was not going to command a great deal of sustained attention. The retrospective understanding came much later. The Imgal Genistelas were most likely a vanguard organism, seeded centuries ahead of a hive fleet's arrival, as left to survive and multiply in isolation after their parent fleet moved on or was destroyed. The two most plausible origin theories are that they were scouts left behind by Hive Fleet Behemoth's advance, moving ahead of the main fleet by generations, or that they were remnants of Hive Fleet Tiamat, possibly carried to the moons aboard unwitting Imperial shipping, having infested a vessel at some earlier point. The truth is probably unknowable. What matters is what they represent. Evidence that the Tyranids had been present in the fringes of the galaxy, waiting, seeding, preparing, long before anyone realized there was something to prepare against. There are other hints in the historical record, fragments and anomalies that the scholars of the Ordo Xenos spent years collating and cross-referencing. Reports from the eastern fringe dating back to the 36th millennium of winged creatures that matched no known species, seen briefly during surveys of dead worlds before the survey teams were lost. System exploration logs that simply stopped mid-transmission from worlds that should have been unremarkable. archaeological sites on abandoned colony worlds where the skeletal remains of colonists showed evidence of genetic modification that could not be explained by disease or mutation. The dots were there. They just needed someone willing to connect them. That person, when the time finally came, was an inquisitor. His name was Fidus Kryptman, and he would spend the better part of 3 centuries as the Imperium's single most persistent and consequential expert on the Tyranid threat. Kryptman was a member of the Ordo Xenos. It's the branch of this Inquisition tasked with studying, cataloguing, and eliminating alien threats to humanity. He was the kind of inquisitor whose defining characteristic was not cruelty or fanaticism or any of the qualities people often associate with that institution, but something more uncommon and in its way more dangerous. He was deeply, almost compulsively thorough. He paid attention to things other people dismissed. He noticed patterns in data that others were not bothering to look for. And when Kryptman began receiving fragmentary reports from the worlds of the Eastern Fringe in the early 740s of the 41st Millennium, reports of worlds going silent, of survey teams failing to report back, of navigation beacons going dark without explanation, he noticed a pattern. The worlds were being consumed, not destroyed in the normal ways, not burned by chaos or overrun by orcs or razed by internal rebellion. They were being consumed. Stripped, emptied of life down to the last microorganism, leaving behind nothing but barren rock under a sky where not even bacteria survived. Something was eating the Eastern Fringe, and it was moving in a direction, and the direction it was moving pointed directly at one of the most important places in the entire Imperium of man. Part 3, First Contact, Tyran Primus and the Naming of Behemoth. The world that gave the Tyranids their name in Imperial records was a place called Tyran Primus. It was not an important world by most measures, a research outpost maintained by the Adeptus Mechanicus, those red-robed scholars and engineers devoted to the ancient science and technology of the Imperium, from sitting on a small planet in the eastern fringe of the galaxy. It had a small population, mostly Mechanicus adepts and their support staff, dedicated to studying the fringes of known space. In the year 745 of the 41st Millennium, they were among the first humans to see a Tyranid hive fleet coming. They did not survive the encounter. Nothing on Tyran Primus survived the encounter, but one of them, a magos of the Adeptus Mechanicus named Varnak, understood what was happening long enough to do something remarkable. As the hive fleet descended, as bioships of impossible scale began blocking out the stars above him, and the shadow in the warp crushed his senses, as the first organisms began their long drop through the atmosphere in mycetic spores like a living rain, Varnak gathered every scrap of data his instruments could capture. He documented, he recorded, he classified and annotated with the kind of precise, systematic thoroughness that the Adeptus Mechanicus at their best are uniquely capable of. And then, knowing that he and everyone around him were about to be consumed, he sealed the data codex he had created and dropped it into a bore shaft 3,000 meters below the planet's surface, where he hoped it might survive, where he hoped someone might eventually find it. When Inquisitor Kryptman arrived at Tyran Primus with his Ordo Xenos retinue, the planet was a dead rock. There was nothing left, not ruins, not bodies, not even the organic residue that normally persisted after mass death. Every molecule of biological matter had been stripped away with the kind of thoroughness that machines could not achieve, that weapons of war could not achieve, that nothing in the Imperium's experience had ever achieved. The air itself was thin and strange, its composition wrong in ways that suggested even the atmospheric chemistry had been partially consumed. Kryptman walked the surface of a world that had been erased, and felt the shape of something enormous and unprecedented pressing in on his understanding. The Adeptus Mechanicus adepts accompanying him located Varnak's bore shaft. They recovered the data codex, and buried in that data, in Varnak's precise and systematic final documentation of the last hours of Tyran Primus, was the first coherent picture of what the Imperium was dealing with. Creatures of a sophistication and biological complexity that had no parallel in any catalogue of known species, living spacecraft of breathtaking scale. Yes, the total consumption of every living thing on the planet conducted with a speed and efficiency that suggested an organism optimized over an incomprehensible span of time to do exactly this, and moving toward the Imperium with a purpose that felt, in Krippmann's carefully chosen words, inevitable. Krippmann understood immediately, not all of it, not the full scope, but enough. This was not a Xenos raid. This was not territorial expansion or resource competition in any normal sense. This was feeding. This was something that had travelled an unimaginable distance to reach this galaxy and was consuming it the way a plague consumes a body. Systematically, efficiently, driven by hunger so absolute, it admitted no other priority. And it was still moving. It was moving toward worlds with more life, more biomass. It was following the gradient of organic richness, the way water follows the gradient of gravity. It was moving toward Ultramar. Krippmann named the threat based on a long imperial tradition of giving alien races designations drawn from the mythic beasts of old Earth. This first hive fleet, this vast living armada that had consumed Tyran Primus like an afterthought on its way to whatever it really wanted, was designated Behemoth. The name fit in ways that went beyond the ancient mythology. Behemoth meant something vast, something foundational, something that could not be moved or negotiated with or appealed to. The oldest human stories describe Behemoth as one of the primordial creatures of creation itself, neither demon nor mortal, simply a force of nature given form. There was a dark poetry in the choice. Krippmann set out immediately to warn the Imperium, and more urgently to reach the commanders of Ultramar in time to allow any preparation at all. The warning he sent via astropathic relay was blunt and unambiguous. The message, which has survived in the Imperial archives and been quoted and analysed endlessly in the centuries since, described the threat in terms that his superiors and peers found, initially, difficult to credit. He wrote of an alien species of extragalactic origin, of living warships that dwarfed anything humanity had built, of a mode of warfare that had no analogue in any prior Xenos conflict. He wrote that if the Hive fleet was not stopped, Ultramar would fall, and if Ultramar fell, the heart of the Imperium would be open. Some of his messages did not arrive, and the shadow in the warp was already affecting astropathic communication in the eastern fringe, which meant that his most urgent dispatches, sent as the Hive fleet's influence spread, either arrived garbled or not at all. Krippmann burned out 3 astropaths in the attempt to push his warnings through the growing psychic interference. He did what he could, and it was not enough, and it was also barely sufficient. The warning reached Macragge. It reached Marneus Calgar, Chapter Master of the Ultramarines, Lord of Macragge, Lord of the single most powerful Space Marine chapter in 1,000 light-years, and Calgar, to his enormous credit, believed it. Meanwhile, on the path between Tyran Primus and Macragge, the Hive fleet moved with the patient, with remorseless hunger that would come to define every Tyranid invasion in the histories yet to be written. World after world on the approach vector simply disappeared. Oculus, a moon-sized observator station the Imperium had claimed 9,000 years earlier, was devoured along with its Mechanicus crew, a modest inconvenience for a fleet of that size. Jagger, homeworld of the Orc freebooters known as the Star Crumpus, whose ships had long been a significant threat to local Imperial shipping, launched its fleet of kill cruisers against Behemoth in what was probably the last act of defiance from a civilization that did not fully understand what it was fighting. The Orcs fought with the enthusiasm they always brought to combat. The Hive fleet ate them, not defeated them in any conventional sense. Ate them is incorporated their biological mass into its own growing body and continued moving toward Ultramar without perceptible pause. The paradise world of Prandium was one of the crown jewels of Ultramar, an agri-world of such extraordinary natural beauty and agricultural richness that it had been called the jewel in Ultramar's crown for generations. Marneus Calgar tried to hold it. He mounted a defense, led his forces to Prandium, and after a week of meditation so profound and still that he reportedly went without food or water for For the entire period, he gave the order to withdraw. The planet could not be held. Trying to hold it would mean losing the forces he would need at Macragge. Prandium was abandoned to the Hive fleet, and the Hive fleet ate it. It ate the soil. It ate the sky. It ate the atmosphere itself. Were the specialized bioships that processed atmospheric matter, drawing even the air of Prandium into their vast digestive systems. Nothing remained. A world that humans had lived on and loved for hundreds of years simply ceased to exist as anything more than a lifeless rock. There is a record of Marneus Calgar's response when he learned that Prandium had been stripped bare. He said that they had been guilty of the sin of pride and that they would have to adapt and develop new strategies, even new weapons. The lesson of Prandium was learned in the only way those lessons ever come, through loss. But even as worlds fell, the Ultramarines and their realm of Ultramar were hardening. Cryptman's warning had given Calgar time, not much, but enough. The planet of Macragge, homeworld of the Ultramarines, was one of the most naturally fortified worlds in the galaxy, with its ring of orbital defense platforms and the great polar fortresses that crowned its landmasses, was being prepared for a siege the likes of which it had never seen. And from behind the light of dying stars and the bodies of consumed worlds, Behemoth came on. Part 4, The First Tyrannic War, Part 1. The hammer falls on Macragge. The battle that history records as the First Tyrannic War has become one of the defining events in the narrative of the 41st millennium, not because the Imperium won cleanly, which it did not because the losses were manageable, which they were absolutely not, but because it was the first time that humanity, at terrible cost, looked directly at the face of the Tyranid threat and did not break. And understanding how close it came to breaking is essential to understanding why the victory at Macragge matters as much as it does. Calgar's strategy was built on a recognition that he was facing something unlike any prior enemy. He had Cryptman's data, he had Varnak's codex, he had information about an enemy that no other Imperial commander had ever faced, and he had to build a defense essentially from scratch, drawing on principles and instincts that had been developed for a completely different kind of war. The Tyranids were not chaos, who fought with supernatural ferocity but whose key elements could be targeted and broken. They were not orcs, who fought with overwhelming numbers but had an internal hierarchy that could be disrupted. They were not any of the Xenos empires the Ultramarines had faced in their long history, and they were a single living weapon aimed at Macragge by an intelligence that felt nothing about the outcome, except as a calculation of whether the world's biomass was worth what it would cost to extract it. Calgar's answer was to meet them in space first. The orbital defences of Macragge were among the finest in the Imperium, and to them he added every ship he could requisition, every weapon platform that could be armed and crewed, every vessel that could be pulled from service across the sector. The fleet that assembled above Macragge in the months before Behemoth's arrival was a formidable thing. It included elements of Battlefleet Tempestus under the command of the Lord Admiral of that fleet, as a critical contribution that brought with it not just warships, but the strategic depth of an institutional military command with resources Calgar alone could not have assembled. The Hive fleet arrived, and the fleet was not enough. The bioships of Hive Fleet Behemoth are almost impossible to describe in terms that convey their true nature. They were not just larger than Imperial ships, they were fundamentally different in the way that a living body is different from a machine. They had no weak points that remained weak points from one encounter to the next, because the hive mind was already adapting. They regenerated damage at a rate that made sustained engagement exhausting and demoralizing. They launched organisms from their internal birthing chambers directly into the void, bioorganisms that did not need to breathe, yet engineered to survive space and designed to infiltrate and disable enemy ships by the brutal and intimate method of tearing through their hulls with physical force. Imperial void combat experience was designed around ships fighting ships. Fighting bioships meant dealing with creatures. The initial space battle cost the Imperium heavily. Not catastrophically, not yet, but the toll was real, and the Ultramarines' fleet, stretched and strained, could not prevent every tendril of the hive fleet from delivering its cargo to the surface. The bioships drove in past the orbital defenses with the inexorable purpose of creatures that had been making this particular journey, or ones very much like it, for millions of years. Mycetic spores rained down on Macragge, and each one a living capsule carrying organisms bred for exactly one purpose: destroying whatever resisted and consuming whatever remained. On the surface, the battle for Macragge was fought across its two great polar fortresses, the northern and southern bastions that had been designed over centuries as anchor points for the planet's defense. Calgar himself was on the planet's surface, directing the defense, fighting alongside his warriors as Space Marine chapter masters did and do. The battle was horrific in the specific way that Tyranid ground combat always is, the sheer relentlessness of it. Imperial forces are designed to fight enemies who run low on ammunition, who feel fear, who tire, who make mistakes born of human frailty. The Tyranid swarms that poured across the surface of Macragge did none of these things. They came in waves that never stopped coming. Every organism that died was simply replaced by another one that had already been adapted to be slightly better at not dying in that particular way. And then the Swarmlord came. The Swarmlord is the pinnacle of Tyranid bioform evolution, the hive mind's most direct instrument of strategic will given physical form. It appeared on Macragge at a location called Cold Steel Ridge, and its arrival transformed the battle in a way that every ultramarine who survived would describe for the rest of their lives. Before the Swarmlord, the Tyranid assaults, though relentless, had an almost mechanical quality, waves of creatures following the paths of least resistance, messy killing everything in their way but doing so without the quality that most distinguished the Swarmlord: tactical adaptation in real time. The Swarmlord did not just fight, it thought. It processed the battlefield with a clarity and speed that matched or exceeded the finest military minds the Imperium possessed, and it directed the swarms with a purpose that was suddenly visible in their movements. What had been a flood became something closer to a surgeon's incision. Marneus Calgar met it on the battlefield. A Space Marine chapter master in Terminator armor, surrounded by his honor guard, the finest individual warriors the Ultramarines had to offer, facing the most dangerous Tyranid organism that had ever been encountered by humanity. What followed became one of the most analysed engagements in Ultramarine chapter lore. Shan the Swarmlord bellowed what could only be described as a challenge, a gesture so apparently human that it has been the subject of debate among Tyranid scholars ever since, whether it represented actual intent or merely a behavioural pattern that mimicked challenge. It charged Calgar directly. Calgar's honor guard could not stop it. In the engagement that followed, the Swarmlord tore through the finest warriors of the chapter, as though their ceramite armor and centuries of martial training were interesting obstacles rather than real impediments. Marneus Calgar himself, wearing the armor of Antilochus and wielding the God-Splitter and Fist of Ultramar, fought the Swarmlord and was grievously wounded. The details of the wound vary depending on the source, but what is consistent is that Calgar was brought down, not killed, but brought to the edge of death in a way that required immediate evacuation. Thunderhawk gunships arrived and pulled him from the surface to the battle barge Octavius in orbit, leaving Cold Steel Ridge to the Tyranids. The northern polar fortress was now exposed. The path to it, which Calgar's presence and command had been anchoring, was open, and within the fortress, the Ultramarines' first company, those veteran warriors in Terminator plate, who represented the living apex of a chapter's martial excellence, prepared to make their stand. These were not ordinary Space Marines. They were the survivors of decades of conflict, warriors who had earned the right to wear Terminator armor through feats of arms that most soldiers could not imagine. But they stood their ground in the tunnels and corridors of the polar fortress as the Tyranid swarms flowed in around them. The entire first company was killed. Every single one. When the battle was finally over and the Ultramarines retook the fortress, they found the bodies of their brothers exactly where they had fallen, arranged in the configurations of their last stands, surrounded by the bodies of the creatures they had killed, in numbers that even in death told a story of extraordinary ferocity. The banner of the first company was recovered from the cold hands of its last bearer. It would not be displayed again for 200 years. From orbit, with Macragge still in the grip of the surface battle, Calgar took command of the fleet engagement. The situation had reached its decisive moment. The Tyranid bioships, and having delivered their ground forces to Macragge, turned away from the planet and moved toward the ringed world of Circe in the outer system.
You know, I want to pause here for just a second because covering all of this in one sitting does something to you. I have been deep in Tyranid lore for a long time now, and the thing that keeps pulling me back to them genuinely is not the horror of the monsters themselves, it is the horror of the indifference. Every other villain 40k wants something recognizable, like Chaos wants your soul, Orcs just want a good fight, and even though the Necrons have a kind of cold dignity to their agenda. But the Tyranids do not know you exist as anything other than calories. That planet you love with the lore about it, the history, the people, the stories, to the hive mind, it's just biomass with a location tag. And what gets me personally, what I think about when I turn this off, is that the Imperials keep winning. Not cleanly, not without catastrophic loss, but they keep showing up. Dante at Baal, the Ultramarines at Macragge, the Toe at Kelshan, all of them knowing the math was wrong and doing it anyway. That is the threat I keep finding buried in this lore, not the monsters, the stubborn refusal to stop being human in the face of something that would erase every trace you ever existed. But anyway, let's go back to the video.
It looked like withdrawal. It was not withdrawal. It was a feint. The hive mind drawing the Imperial fleet after it, while concealing a second fleet among the rings of Circe. Calgar drove his ships in pursuit, following what appeared to be a retreating enemy, and came around the rings of Circe to find the concealed fleet waiting. It should have been the end. The Imperial fleet, strung out from the pursuit, was suddenly engaged on multiple sides by a larger enemy that had the advantages of positioning and preparation. The numbers were against them, and the geometry was against them, and the Tyranids were adapting even as the battle unfolded. Then the ships of Battlefleet Tempestus arrived, but dropping from warp translation points that put them behind the Tyranid formation and completing a pincer that the hive mind's feint had not anticipated. The battle became a grinder, both sides taking catastrophic losses, neither able to break cleanly. And then Admiral Raff, Lord Commanding of Battlefleet Tempestus, made a decision that has been honoured and mourned in equal measure ever since. The Emperor-class battleship Dominus Astra, the fleet's largest vessel and the anchor of its fighting power, turned its prow directly into the heart of the Tyranid fleet, not in attack. Its weapons were already spent. It drove into the bioships at full power, not firing a single shot, crossing the distance to the centre of the hive fleet with an intent that every soul on board understood completely. At the heart of the Tyranid formation, with bioships closing in on all sides, and nothing left but the choice of how to use what remained, the Dominus Astra detonated its warp drives. The resulting explosion was not a conventional explosion. The detonating warp drives tore a hole between real space and the Imperium, creating a catastrophic vortex that pulled the Dominus Astra and everything within its immediate radius into the warp simultaneously. Hundreds of bioships, some of the largest and most important organisms in Hive Fleet behemoth structure, were dragged screaming into that vortex and torn apart by the howling energies within. The psychic connection between those ships and the rest of the fleet, the synaptic link that allowed the hive mind to coordinate its organisms on the surface of Macragge, was shattered. On the ground, something profound happened. So the Tyranid organisms already on the surface, suddenly cut off from the hive mind's guidance by the deaths of so many synapse-bearing bioships, lost coherence, not their physical abilities, not their ferocity, but the directing intelligence that made them more than animals. They reverted to instinctive behavior, still deadly but no longer coordinated, no longer responding to the larger strategic picture with the terrible, purposeful intelligence they had shown. The Ultramarines on the surface, exhausted and battered and reduced to fractions of their starting strength, did not need the enemy to become easy. They just needed it to become possible. The surface was cleared. The bioships in orbit were hunted down. Hive Fleet Behemoth, the first great Tyranid invasion of the Milky Way galaxy, was broken. The survivors of the First Tyrannic War looked out over what victory had cost them and found it difficult to feel entirely victorious. Macragge itself had been deeply invaded. The polar fortresses were wrecked, their ancient stone and sacred halls broken and choked with the bodies of alien organisms and ultramarine dead. The First Company was gone, all of its Terminators, all of their experience and gene seed, and the irreplaceable particular humanity of those specific individuals. The paradise world of Prandium was gone, consumed so completely it might as well never have existed. Dozens of other worlds along the Hive Fleet's approach vector were stripped bare. Civilizations that had existed for centuries simply ended as efficiently as brushing crumbs from a table. The Ultramarines would spend a full century rebuilding their strength before the chapter banner of Ultramar could be carried into battle again by a full-strength force. The wound was that deep. What did they gain? They had held the center. They had information that had not existed before, hard-won and drenched in blood, but real. Marneus Calgar himself, recovering from his wounds, turned the experience into doctrine. He emerged from his recovery not broken, but harder, rethinking strategies and approaches from the ground up, accepting that pride in proven methods was a luxury they could not afford against an enemy that adapted specifically to those methods. From that rethinking came new approaches to Tyranid warfare, and from the experiences of the veterans who had survived the fighting at Macragge, Chaplain Ortan Cassius, what the Ultramarines' Master of Sanctity, drew the founding members of a new institution, the Tyrannic War Veterans, warriors who specialized in studying and fighting the Great Devourer, warriors who would share their knowledge with the Death Watch and with Space Marine chapters across the galaxy, ensuring that the lessons written in the blood of the First Company were not wasted. The chapter banner was quietly put away, the names of the dead were carved, and in the silence after the first storm, the careful work of preparing for the next one began. Because Krypton knew, even then, that there would be a next one. The Tyranid Hive fleets encountered to date were scouts, advanced elements of something larger. The Hive fleet that had nearly consumed Macragge was enormous by any prior measure of xenological threat, and yet the patterns in the data suggested it was not the whole of what was coming. Somewhere beyond the galactic rim, moving with the slow, inexorable patience of things that measured time in geological scales, other fleets were beginning their approach. The question was not whether more would come. The question was how much time they had. The answer turned out to be about 250 years. Part 5. The Splinter Plague and Hive Fleet Gorgon. In the aftermath of Hive Fleet Behemoth's destruction, the Imperium allowed itself a certain comfort. Not complacency exactly, the scars were too fresh and too wide for that, but a kind of measured relief. Behemoth was gone. The eastern fringe had been defended. The cost had been extraordinary, but the cost had been paid, and humanity still stood in the space where it had been standing. The great galactic extinction that Krypton had feared when he first read Varnak's Codex had not come to pass. The lesson, carefully and painfully learned, was that Tyranid Hive fleets could be stopped. What the Imperium was slower to understand, and what would haunt the next 2 centuries, was that stopping a Hive fleet did not mean ending it. The destruction of Hive Fleet Behemoth's central mass at Macragge was decisive, but not complete. The battle happened primarily in space and around the polar fortresses, and during the long weeks that the ground campaign had raged, thousands of Tyranid organisms had been dispersed across the planet's surface and scattered by the disruption of the hive mind's control. These were cut off, as no longer fully coherent, but still alive and still breeding in small pockets across the ruined landscape of Macragge and the worlds along Behemoth's approach vector. The splinter fleets, smaller concentrations of Tyranid bioships that had been separated from the main fleet during the fighting, drifted away into the eastern fringe to find whatever biomass they could reach and slowly, quietly rebuild their numbers. For decades after Macragge, the Imperium dealt with these splinters, running battles across the eastern fringe, Deathwatch kill teams hunting Tyranid infestations on worlds that should have been clean, Space Marine forces responding to emergency calls from isolated systems where splinter fleets had arrived and begun the familiar process of consumption, where each engagement was smaller than the last Great War, but no less deadly for the people living through it. A world being consumed by a splinter fleet of 100 bioships is still being consumed. The people there are still dead. One of the most notorious survivors of Hive Fleet Behemoth's scattered remnants was a carnifex that came to be called Old One-Eye. Carnifexes are among the most physically imposing organisms in the Tyranid swarm, biological siege weapons shaped into something that walks upright and tears through fortifications with its bare limbs. Old One-Eye had been blinded in one eye during the fighting at Macragge, and in the way of Tyranid organisms had not died from that wound, but had adapted around it, the wound itself incorporated into its body as a kind of grotesque scar tissue, as it was encountered and killed multiple times over the decades following Macragge. But the hive mind's ability to regrow from stored genetic templates meant that each killing merely provided a template for a better successor. Old One-Eye became something unusual in a species with no individuals, a recurring presence with a kind of dark persistence, a symbol of the fact that victory over Tyranids was always provisional. But the most significant development of the post-Behemoth period, and one of the most instructive chapters in the entire history of the Tyranid invasions, unfolded not in Imperial space at all, but in the domains of the Tau Empire. This story belongs to a hive fleet called Gorgon, and it is the story of the most intense and instructive arms race in the galaxy's recent history. As Gorgon had originated as a splinter of Behemoth, one of those separated fragments that had avoided destruction at Macragge and spent the following decades consuming whatever isolated worlds it could reach to rebuild its numbers. It was smaller than the main fleet had been, and it had drifted away from Imperial space toward the eastern fringe in a direction that eventually brought it to the borders of the Tau Empire in 899 Mimtson 41. It would reach the Tau's frontiers, having grown, through the consumption of poorly defended worlds, into something that merited classification as a full hive fleet in its own right. The Tau Empire is in many ways one of the more unusual civilizations in the 40th and 41st millennia of the setting, founded relatively recently compared to the ancient empires of the galaxy, as the Tau are a technologically progressive species who fight primarily with sophisticated ranged weaponry and battlefield technology. Their fire caste, the warrior caste, excels at coordinated long-range combat. They are pragmatic, adaptive, and willing to work with alien auxiliaries, such as the Kroot mercenaries who fight alongside Tau forces. They are also, crucially, not a civilization that had any prior direct experience with Tyranid invasion. The first reports that something was wrong came from the disappearance of trading partners on the worlds beyond the Tau's frontiers, Imperial worlds that suddenly went silent. The Tau were aware that something was happening, but had no concept yet of what it was. The battle for the world of Shadreg was where the Tau first learned what they were fighting. Shadreg was a forested colony world, and when the first wave of gargoyles, the winged bioforms that serve as Tyranid aerial troops, descended on its orbital facilities and began dismantling the shipyards, the Tau defenders responded with exactly the kind of coordinated, technically sophisticated defense they had developed over generations of warfare. Their interceptor systems were excellent. They destroyed wave after wave of gargoyles in large numbers. And then something happened that was the true beginning of the Gorgon campaign. The next wave of gargoyles was different. Their chitinous hides had been coated with a refractive mucus that reduced the effectiveness of the Tau interceptor fire. Not eliminated it, reduced it, just enough that more of the second wave survived than the first. And in the surviving organisms, yet the hive mind had its feedback data on how well that particular adaptation had performed, and it began growing the third wave. The dance that followed between Gorgon and the Tau at Shadreg and the worlds around it became, in retrospect, one of the most purely illustrative examples of Tyranid adaptive biology in the entire historical record. The Tau would devise a defense. The Gorgon's organisms would probe it, take casualties, and return modified. The Tau would update their technology in response. The Gorgon would adapt again, round after round, iteration after iteration, both sides racing to stay ahead of the other in an arms race that was happening not over years, but over weeks and sometimes days. Gorgon, of all the hive fleets ever encountered, showed the most extreme and rapid adaptive biology, and it generated more unique bioform varieties than any other hive fleet on record, each one a response to a specific toe capability that had proven effective. A Tau Fire warrior named Shasil Vorka became one of the defining figures of this campaign, a warrior who stayed behind when the main force withdrew from Shardrake, ostensibly to cover the retreat, but actually with a plan of his own. Vorka had recognized something crucial. Gorgon's relentless rapid adaptation was forcing it to rely on smaller, more quickly bred organisms that could be rapidly iterated. The trade-off was that it could afford relatively fewer of the large, complex creatures that served as synapse nodes, the organisms that maintained the hive mind's connection across the swarm. Vorka launched a series of suicide missions specifically targeting those synapse creatures, disrupting the coherence of the swarm. His tactics worked. He drove the Gorgon from Shardrake. The world was almost completely consumed by the time he succeeded, stripped to near barrenness by the Ripper swarms. But it was driven off, and the data from his approach was invaluable. The campaign climaxed in the Kelshan system, where a situation of extraordinary complexity developed. An Imperial fleet commanded by Castellan Krask had emerged from a warp journey that had taken far longer than expected, arriving to find not the Damocles crusade they had been dispatched to fight, which had ended a century and a half earlier, but instead a planet under siege by Gorgon. The Kelshan Tow fleet under Koro Vannon, as heavily retrofitted to counter Gorgon's specific immunities, was already engaged. Both Imperial and Tow forces found themselves fighting the same enemy in the same place, and the pragmatic decision was made, perhaps the most pragmatic in the entire history of human-Tow relations, to stop shooting at each other and cooperate against the Hive fleet. The combined forces of two civilizations that were normally at war with each other proved decisive. Gorgon's adaptation engine, so brilliantly effective against any single coherent military system, could not adapt simultaneously to the wildly different weapon types, tactics, and biological signatures of both Imperial human forces and Tow technology. The Battle of Worldspine Ridge in 903 Millennium 41 saw the last dominatrix and hive tyrant of Gorgon destroyed. The hive fleet was finished, but Gorgon was never truly erased. 3 bioships had broken off just before the final battle and fled back toward the galactic rim, carrying within their adaptive genomes the full library of biological solutions the fleet had developed during its 4-year war with the Tow. The Tow pursued them, believing that as long as those ships were destroyed, the knowledge would die with them. They were wrong. The Tyranid hive mind does not require physical contact to share information across its components. The knowledge Gorgon had accumulated about how to fight and overcome Tow military capabilities was already part of the broader hive mind's understanding. Future fleets would benefit from it. The regions of Tow space devastated by Gorgon's passage came to be known as the Zone of Silence, barren worlds on the Tow's frontier, as stripped of the life that had made them worth having. And the lesson of Gorgon was filed away by both races, though interpreted very differently. The Tow took from it the conviction that with enough technological sophistication and adaptive thinking, the Tyranids could be fought. The Ordo Xenos took from it the darker understanding that every Tyranid defeat was also a learning experience for the hive mind, that every clever tactic developed to fight them was eventually incorporated into what the swarms would face next time. By the late 900s of the 41st millennium, 2.5 centuries after Macragge, the eastern fringe was quieter. The Imperium's administrators had begun to question whether the heavy-armed presence maintained in the region was really necessary. Kripman was still watching, still cataloguing. He's still running his probability assessments over reams of data that painted a picture nobody wanted to look at too directly. But even he could point to no immediate sign of a new primary hive fleet. The splinters were being contained. The Zone of Silence was being monitored. Things seemed, in the way that things sometimes do just before they become catastrophically otherwise manageable. Then the Genestealer cults began to activate. Part 6. The Second Tyrannic War. Hive Fleet Kraken. The first sign of Hive Fleet Kraken was not in space. It was on the ground. Worlds along the eastern fringe, worlds that had been quiet and unremarkable for generations, began erupting in what the Imperium's authorities initially classified as political instability, riots, terrorism, sabotage of key industrial facilities, violent uprisings against local government, the kinds of civil unrest that the Imperium dealt with constantly across its million worlds, the kind that could usually be attributed to poor governance, resource shortages, or the ordinary miseries of life in an authoritarian stellar empire. When petitions arrived at the Administratum requesting the reduction of the armed presence in the eastern fringe on the grounds that the behemoth threat was clearly over, and the population was simply frustrated by living in a militarized zone, it seemed plausible. Reasonable even. Krippmann did not think it was reasonable. He noticed that the dissenting adepts who argued most loudly for reducing the military presence had an unusual geographic profile. They had all, at some point, come from the southeastern region of the galaxy. Azor had travelled there recently. He brought this to the attention of the Inquisition, and an investigation was quietly opened. The conclusion it reached was not comforting. The uprisings were not political, they were biological. The populations of those worlds had been infiltrated by Genestealer cults, those multi-generational networks of Tyranid-infected humans who had been seeded generations before the Hive fleet arrived, and who, as the fleet's shadow in the warp began to extend its influence toward them, received a psychic activation signal from the Hive mind that triggered centuries of patient preparation into sudden violent action. The cults knew, at some level below conscious thought, that their parent fleet was coming. They rose to weaken the worlds for the consumption to come. Hive Fleet Kraken arrived in 992 EMS-41. As the difference in character from Behemoth was immediately apparent to anyone who had studied the first invasion. Behemoth had been direct. A single enormous force driving straight for the most important target it could reach. A battering ram of biological mass aimed at the heart of Ultramar. Kraken was something different. Where Behemoth had one center, Kraken had many. Where Behemoth had one trajectory, Kraken spread across a wide front in multiple simultaneous tendrils, each one a significant invasion force in its own right. The worlds along the eastern fringe began falling not one after another, but many at once, a pattern of consumption spreading across an arc of space so vast that no single defense could cover it. Sotha fell, Miral fell, Graya fell, Radnar fell. The names accumulated with a speed that was, in itself, a weapon of psychological warfare on a species that had not yet accepted that this was actually happening again. Among the early casualties was the world of Sotha, homeworld of the Scythes of the Emperor Space Marine chapter. The Scythes were an old and honoured chapter with roots in an older founding than most. Their homeworld was not chosen by accident. Its fall meant the loss of their fortress monastery, their recruitment grounds, their connection to the traditions and resources that sustained a chapter's identity across generations. The Scythes of the Emperor were effectively broken as a chapter in the operational sense, reduced to whatever forces had been deployed away from Sotha when the swarms arrived. They made their last stand on the world of Miral, fighting to preserve what gene seed they could, what lives they could, from the remnant of what had been a proud force. The Lamenter's chapter, another casualty of the expanding front, suffered similarly catastrophic losses. The Hive fleet strategy of spreading across a wide front achieved exactly what the Hive mind intended. Imperial responses had to be split, forces committed here and then there and then somewhere else, never concentrated enough at any single point to do more than slow the consumption. The eastern fringe was being consumed in bites rather than swallowed whole, and the slower pace of it, paradoxically, made it harder to bring the full weight of the Imperium's military machine to bear. A single enormous enemy fleet at a single location could be focused on. 1,000 separate swarms across hundreds of star systems was a different kind of problem entirely. Yet the craft world Iyanden watched the approach of Kraken through the long sight of their farseers, and their grief was prophetic. Iyanden was one of the greatest of the craft world Eldari, those vast wandering world ships that carried the remnant populations of a civilization that had destroyed itself thousands of years before. Its population at the height of its glory had numbered in the billions, a society of ancient sophistication and artistic achievement housed in a vessel the size of a small moon. The farseers of Iyanden had sensed the approach of Hive Fleet Kraken long before it arrived, and had engaged in bitter debate about what to do. The craft world could not outrun the fleet. Craft worlds are not designed for speed, and the gap between their best possible velocity and the Hive Fleet's approach was not closable. So they could not call for enough allied forces to stop what was coming. Farseer Kelmon, the spiritual leader of Iyanden, made the decision that all would fight. Every citizen of Iyanden was mobilized, every guardian, every warrior of the Aspect Shrines, every Wraithguard construct that housed the soul of a dead Eldari in its ceramic and wraithbone body. The avatar of Kaela Mensha Kane was woken, the war god aspect of the ancient Eldari deity, whose physical manifestation was kept dormant in ordinary times, woken from its slumber and given the wailing doom, the weapon that was the physical expression of the war god's power. Kelman gave the order for the spirit stones, those crystalline vessels that preserved the souls of the dead against the endless hunger of Slanesh, to be opened. From calling the inhabitants of the Infinity Circuit back into Wraith constructs so the dead of Iyanden could fight beside the living. It was an act of enormous solemnity, a draining of the spiritual reserves that were Iyanden's truest wealth, done because there was no alternative. They held for a time. The void battle above and around the craft world was fought with the desperate ferocity of a civilization that knew exactly what defeat meant, that knew the Tyranids would eat not just the living, but the Infinity Circuit that held the souls of their dead, consuming even the dead in their hunger. Iyanden's fleet, combining with Prince Iriel's arrival, inflicted enormous casualties on the bioship swarms. But the Tyranids kept coming, and the fleet's losses were terrible, and eventually the bioships broke through, and the Tyranids began landing on the craft world itself. Prince Iriel's arrival requires its own account, because it is one of the most dramatic moments in all of the Second Tyrannic War. Iriel had been exiled from Iyanden, sent away in disgrace for a decision that had cost the craft world dearly in a prior conflict. He had been sailing the void with his corsair fleet, a wandering prince who had lost his home. When the news reached him of what was coming, he returned, not because he had been forgiven, not because he was asked. He returned with everything he had, his ships throwing themselves into the Tyranid biofleet in a strike that combined with the surviving Iyanden vessels to break the orbital siege. And he came back to his people in their hour of destruction, and whatever complicated history lay between them dissolved in the face of what was happening to his world. On the surface of the craft world, battles were fought in corridors and halls that had been sacred spaces for millennia, places of art and memory and learning converted in an hour into killing grounds. Carnifexes tore through walls of wraithbone. Hormagaunts poured through the breaches faster than aspect warriors could seal them. The avatar of Cain charged into the swarms, and for a time held a section of the front through sheer terrifying presence. But the swarms kept coming, and the avatar was brought low, and the battle line contracted toward the craft world's heart. The hive tyrant that led the invasion was the intelligence directing the assault on the surface, and not the swarm lord, but a powerful and capable organism that had been adapting to Eldari tactics throughout the campaign, and was orchestrating the swarms with a visible strategic intelligence. Farseer Kelmon died in the fighting. The losses were appalling by any measure. Iriel went to face the hive tyrant himself, and he brought with him the Spear of Twilight. The Spear of Twilight was a weapon from Iyanden's armories, one of those relics of Eldari engineering, whose exact properties were known only to the craft world's most senior seers. It was a weapon of extraordinary power. It was also, and this detail matters, a weapon that carried a curse. The wielder would inevitably die from its use. Iriel had been told this. He took it anyway, With one fluid motion, Prince Iriel drove the Spear of Twilight through the head of the hive tyrant. The creature died. The synapse web on the surface fractured. The coherence of the swarms broke. The organisms that had been pushing toward the craftworld's heart reverted to disconnected instinctive behavior, and the Eldari, battered and reduced and grieving, began the slow and terrible work of clearing them. Iyanden had been saved. The craftworld was in ruins. 4/5 of its population were dead. 4/5 of the people who had lived there, who had thought and created and argued and loved and mourned, were gone. The forests of Iyanden, the ancient spaces cultivated over millennia, were devastated. The fleet was a shadow of itself. And the souls of the Eldari, whose spirit stones had been destroyed by the Tyranids during the fighting, were not simply dead, they were consumed. What the Tyranids had eaten them in a sense that went beyond the physical, the soul substance preserved in those stones incorporated into the hive fleet's biological mass and lost to the infinity circuit forever. Iriel survived, but the Spear of Twilight's curse had already begun its work. He would live, but never again without the presence of that slow death working through him. His redemption and his doom came together, inseparably, on the day he saved his people. The Second Tyrannic War's main Imperial campaign had been running simultaneously with the disaster at Iyanden, and its decisive engagement came at the planet of Ikar 4. Ikar 4 was one of the great hive worlds of the Ultima Segmentum, its massive industrial capacity contributing enormously to the Imperium's defensive output. When a tendril of hive fleet kraken drove toward it, the world's Genestealer cult, activated by the fleet's approach, rose in bloody rebellion. The rebellion damaged the factories and weakened the already stretched defenders just as the first bioships began entering the system. The timing was not coincidental. It never was. Marneus Calgar came to Ikar 4. He was older now, marked by the wounds of Macragge and the century of rebuilding that had followed, but his strategic mind was sharper for all of that experience. He brought what he had learned from the First Tyrannic War and applied it with methodical precision. The tactics he had developed in the aftermath of Macragge, the hard-won adaptations and doctrinal changes that had been burned into the Ultramarines by the cost of the first engagement, were deployed in a campaign that the scholars have analysed extensively in the centuries since. Ikar IV also saw one of the first recorded deployments of Tyranid biotitans, those enormous organisms that served as the hive mind's equivalent of the walking god machines that the Titan legions fielded. The appearance of biotitans on the battlefield represented a significant escalation and was a sobering reminder that the Tyranids' biological engineering operated at every scale. In the most significant personal engagement of the campaign, Calgar faced the Swarmlord again. The hive mind had regenerated it since Macragge, and it stood now on the fields of Ikar 4, with the accumulated experience of that prior encounter incorporated into its biology and behaviour. A Swarmlord rebuilt from the memory of its previous defeat, refined by whatever the hive mind had learned from studying how Calgar had fought and almost been destroyed the first time. This time, the engagement went differently. The Swarmlord fell to Calgar's blades, and the Ultramarines sustained pressure, and its death, with the orbital situation also in the Imperium's favour, broke the back of Kraken's assault. The swarms on the surface lost strategic coherence, and the long work of hunting and exterminating the remaining organisms could begin. Nearly 1 billion lives had been lost during the conflict on Ikar 4 alone, the cost of holding one city on one planet against one tendril of one hive fleet. Hive fleet Kraken was broken at Ikar 4 and Iyanden, though the scattered remnants scattered toward the galactic core, creating splinter fleets that would continue to threaten worlds for decades. As for what was less obvious in the immediate aftermath was something Kripman had already noticed. The pattern in his data was not 2 hive fleets. It was not even 3. The vectors, the timing, the scale of what he was seeing when he looked at the whole picture suggested something worse. Something much worse was coming. Less than 5 years after Ikar IV, his calculations confirmed it. A new hive fleet was already approaching, larger than Behemoth, larger than Kraken, approaching from a direction that no one had expected. Part 7. The Death Watch and the Lessons Between Wars. There is a tendency, when telling the history of the Tyrannic Wars, to jump from battle to battle without dwelling on the spaces in between. But those spaces matter. What happened in the gaps between the great invasions shaped how the Imperium fought, as how it prepared, and in some cases how badly it failed to prepare for what came next. The Death Watch deserves more attention than it usually receives in these histories. Founded long before the Tyrannic Wars, but shaped by them more than by anything else, the Death Watch is the militant arm of the Ordo Xenos, the alien-hunting branch of the Inquisition. It consists of space marines drawn from dozens of different chapters, warriors who temporarily give up their chapter colors to serve in black armor, marked with a single silver pauldron, brought together specifically for the purpose of dealing with alien threats that require expert, specialized response. They operate in kill teams, as small groups of extraordinary warriors who combine the different specialized skills of their parent chapters into something more versatile, and arguably more dangerous than any single chapter's fighting approach. After the First Tyrannic War, and especially after the Second, the Death Watch became the primary institutional repository of anti-Tyranid tactical knowledge across the Imperium. The Tyrannic War veterans that Chaplain Cassius had founded from the survivors of Macragge fed their expertise into the Death Watch's training doctrines. Kill teams operating in the Eastern Fringe learned from every encounter with splinter fleets, developing the specific approaches that worked against different Tyranid bioforms, identifying the synapse creatures that served as command nodes and prioritizing their elimination, was learning which weapons were effective against which types of chitin and which biological structures were essential enough to the hive mind's control that their disruption caused maximum cascade disruption in the organisms around them. This knowledge was precious, and it was hard-won. Every battle, every fallen kill team member, every failed approach and successful adaptation contributed to a body of doctrine that made the Imperium's anti-Tyranid forces progressively better at their specific task. The tragedy was that this knowledge was always running behind the hive mind's ability to adapt. Every lesson learned was incorporated into future swarms in a way that invalidated part of what had been learned. It was not a static competition. It was an arms race in which one side had the disadvantage of mortality and the other had the disadvantage of losing organisms that might have been tactically useful. A peculiar symmetry that the scholars of the Ordo Xenos spent years trying to find a useful angle on. The period between the Second and Third Tyrannic Wars also saw the growing realization, among those paying attention, that the great hive fleets were not all the Tyranid presence in the galaxy. The splinter fleets, those fragments of broken hive fleets that wandered the Eastern Fringe and beyond, consuming what they could find and slowly growing again, were a constant low-level threat that consumed military resources, kept populations in states of chronic fear, and, most troublingly, continued to supply the hive mind with data from every engagement they fought. And every planet defended, every Tyranid organism killed in any context anywhere in the galaxy, was potentially feeding the hive mind with information about how that particular type of defense worked. Inquisitor Cryptman, now one of the most senior and respected figures in the Ordo Xenos, was not resting. In the years following Icar 4, he was running calculations that drew on centuries of accumulated data about Tyranid behavior, trajectory, scale, and timing. He was doing the thing that defined him, looking at the numbers without flinching from what they said. And what they said was that in 997 M41, less than 5 years after the Second Tyrannic War had supposedly ended, something was already approaching. It was bigger than Behemoth. It was bigger than Kraken. And it was coming from below the galactic plane, in a direction no one had been watching, a vector that the standard defensive arrangements on the Eastern Fringe were completely unprepared to cover. Cryptman implemented the Cryptman census. He burned out dozens of astropaths in the process, driving those sensitive human instruments of communication past their design limits, forcing communications through the already thickening shadow in the warp that preceded the approaching fleet. He contacted scores of worlds on every fringe of the Imperium, asking for status reports, cataloguing the responses, mapping the silence. The worlds that did not respond told the story. The worlds that went quiet one after another, following a pattern that formed unmistakably in the data, the pattern of an enormous living entity moving through space from below. He named it Leviathan. Part 8, The Third Tyrannic War, Part 1. The Jaws close Hive Fleet. Leviathan arrived in 997 Mansfield. Schottenton, and it arrived with a geometry designed to maximize terror and tactical helplessness. Where Behemoth had come in a single mass and Kraken had spread across a wide front, Leviathan did something more sophisticated and in some ways more terrifying than either. It approached from below the galactic plane, from the direction that the Imperium's defensive dispositions were least prepared for, and it attacked not in one place, but in two simultaneously. Two enormous tendrils, separated by hundreds of light years, driving upward through the galactic plane from below, their trajectories designed to eventually meet, closing like the jaws of some incomprehensible predator around a section of the galaxy that included some of the most important worlds in the Imperium. Everything caught between those two jaws would be isolated. Communication would be severed, warp travel would be disrupted, and the worlds trapped inside would be stripped bare before the jaws finally met. The worlds that went silent first were on the outer edges of the southern galactic plane, far from the established eastern fringe defenses. By the time Krypton had assembled his picture of what was happening, the shadow in the warp was already blanketing an enormous arc of space and worlds were falling. The speed was both impressive and deeply demoralizing. Leviathan had not made Kraken's mistake of advancing along a front that could be responded to, and it was advancing from a direction the Imperium had not prepared for, and it was advancing simultaneously on multiple vectors. The world of Tarsis Ultra stood directly in the path of one of Leviathan's main tendrils. The tendril aimed most directly at Terra in the Segmentum Solar. Inquisitor Krypton himself directed the defense there, combining forces from the Ultramarines under Captain Uriel Ventris of the 4th Company with the Mortifactors, a Space Marine chapter with their own ancient traditions, and elements of the Astra Militarum under Colonel Octavius Rabalak. The campaign that followed was documented in extraordinary detail and has become one of the foundational texts of anti-Tyranid tactical doctrine. It included a feat that should not have been possible, the actual capture of a lictor, as one of those terrifying hunter-assassin organisms that served the Tyranid swarm as advanced scouts and assassins. Lictors are not creatures that should be capturable. They are evolved specifically to avoid capture, to remain undetected, to strike and withdraw. But Krypton's kill teams managed it, securing the lictor in a stasis field while it was still functional enough to be biologically useful. And from that captured lictor, Krypton's Adeptus Mechanicus biologists, Magos Locard, developed something that the Ordo Xenos had been theorizing about for decades. A biological weapon that could specifically target the hive mind's command structure on Tarsis Ultra. A pathogen derived from the lictor's own genetic material. One that could interfere with the synaptic connections that held the Tyranid swarm together under the hive mind's guidance. As at the Battle of Tarsis Ultra, the weapon was deployed directly against the Norn Queen, whose presence was sustaining the swarm's coherence on that world. The biological weapon disrupted the hive mind's coherency with the invading organisms, causing the cascade failure of synaptic control that left the swarm fragmented and vulnerable. The organisms did not die immediately. They reverted to animalistic behavior, turning on each other in the absence of coordinating intelligence, and the Imperial forces were able to systematically eliminate them. Tarsis Ultra held. It was the first major victory of the Third Tyrannic War, and it came at enormous cost. The Mortifactors and Ultramarines units who fought there were heavily depleted. The population of Tarsis Ultra had suffered catastrophically, but the world was alive, and it had not been consumed. And the biological weapon developed there would be studied and refined and eventually contributed to the broader understanding of how Tyranid command structures could be disrupted. But Krypton's victory at Tarsis Ultra was only one engagement on one world. Leviathan was not one tendril, it was many, and they were moving. The Forge world of Warhammer 4, home of the Legio Gryphonicus Titan Legion, lay in the path of another tendril. Warhammer 4 was one of the most important Forge worlds in the galaxy's southern regions, the source of some of the finest war machinery in the Imperium's arsenal. Its Skitarii legions were among the most skilled in the galaxy. Its fortifications were the product of centuries of tech priest engineering. Krypton's cordon called for the abandonment of Warhammer 4 to deny the Hive fleet the biomass it would gain from consuming it. The Adeptus Mechanicus refused. They refused because Griffon the Fourth was not just a factory. It was a sacred repository of technology, of knowledge, of the living connection between humanity's present and the ancient understanding of how to build and maintain the machines that kept civilization functioning. The concept of abandoning it to alien consumption was not something the Mechanicus could accept. They prepared to defend it. They deployed their Titans, those enormous walking war machines that were the ultimate expression of human martial engineering, and their Skitarii, and every weapon system they had. They sent messages back to Krypton informing him that Griffon the Fourth would not be abandoned. It was within days of Leviathan's tendrils reaching the system, the planet was overrun. The Skitarii were overwhelmed by the sheer weight of the swarms. The Legio Gryphonicus Titans, those magnificent machines that could level city blocks with a single weapon discharge, were surrounded and brought down by the living siege organisms the hive mind deployed when it encountered things that needed to be dismantled. Tyranofexes, those enormous biocannon-wielding creatures, tore the Titans apart at range, while Hierophants, those massive bio-titans that were the hive mind's answer to human walker technology, engaged them directly. In 3 days, one of the most important and well-defended forge worlds in the southern galaxy was consumed. The Legio Gryphonicus ceased to exist. The Cryptman took note of the refusal and its consequences and made his calculations and kept moving. The cordon he had begun establishing, those strings of abandoned and sterilized worlds designed to deny Leviathan the biomass it needed to sustain its advance, was still being built. But it was not enough. The Hive fleet was too large and moving too fast for a cordon of dead worlds to starve it effectively. He needed a larger solution. He needed something that would consume Leviathan's attention the way Leviathan consumed worlds. The plan Krypton devised next was the most audacious, the most controversial, and the most consequential strategic maneuver in the entire history of the Tyrannic Wars. It was also, depending on how you look at it, either brilliant or catastrophic or both simultaneously. The Inquisition was weighing his actions in the context of the Exterminatus orders he had already signed for countless inhabited worlds to create his cordon, presented him with a Carta Extremis. He was stripped of his rank and title, and cast out from the institution he had served for nearly 3 centuries. He was excommunicated from the Inquisition itself. He did not stop. The Orc Empire of Octarius occupied a dense cluster of star systems not far from Leviathan's advancing front. It was home to one of the largest Orc populations in the galaxy, billions of the most biologically robust, violently enthusiastic fighting organisms that the Milky Way had produced outside of the Tyranids themselves. The Orcs of Octarius were not sophisticated by any measure, but they were made of extremely tough biology, was they were aggressive to a degree that made most other species look lethargic, and they would fight literally anything that challenged them, with enthusiasm that other species reserved for only the most important battles. They were, Krypton had calculated, exactly the kind of target that a hive fleet attacking on a biomass acquisition strategy would find irresistible. The problem was that the Orcs were not attacking Leviathan. They were not in Leviathan's immediate path. Getting the hive fleet to divert toward Octarius, rather than continuing on its current trajectory toward the Imperium's most vital worlds, required a trigger. Something to draw the hive mind's attention toward that particular cluster of systems. Krypton obtained a brood of live genostealers. His kill teams took them from a space hulk at serious cost. He placed the brood in a stasis field aboard a vessel, a space hulk called the Perdition's Flame, that had recently emerged from the warp. He arranged for that vessel to be in the path of Leviathan's advance, positioned so that when the Genestealers awoke, their psychic signature would be detectable to the hive mind. Then he destroyed a moon, specifically the moon of Geist, to alter the Hulk's trajectory and aim it directly at the Octarius system. As the Genestealers woke and sent their faint psychic beacon outward, a tendril of Leviathan turned to follow it, drawn by the biological trail of its own organisms like a predator following a scent. The tendril entered the Octarius system and met the Orcs, and the Octarius War began. The plan worked. In the short term, Leviathan was diverted. Whilst the immediate threat to the Imperium's most vital worlds was reduced, the jaws that had been closing on such a wide section of the galaxy were disrupted by this unexpected engagement on Leviathan's flank. Krypton's most catastrophic predictions about what would happen without intervention did not immediately come true. In that narrow technical sense, it succeeded. It also almost certainly made everything worse in the long run. The Orcs of Octarius had been a serious military threat before. After engaging with Leviathan's forces in sustained combat, both sides began growing stronger through the conflict. Every Orc killed fed biological material to the hive fleet. Every Tyranid killed fed the Orc ecology of violence and collective growth. Orcs from light years away were drawn to Octarius by the scale and intensity of the fighting, was because the Orcish biology responds to sustained combat by producing larger, more powerful individuals. A feedback loop that meant the more they fought, the more formidable the Orcs who were fighting became. And the Tyranids were absorbing Orc DNA with every engagement, incorporating those survival traits into their own organisms. The creatures that came off the Norn Queen's production lines in Octarius were becoming something new, hybridized with Orcish biological toughness in ways that had not existed before. The implications for whatever emerged from that conflict as a victor were deeply unpleasant to consider. What could be said was that the Octarius War had bought time, not safety, not victory, time. And with that time, there were more worlds to fight for, more names to be written into the records of the Third Tyrannic War. And the war was far from over. Part 9, the Third Tyrannic War. Part 2, the Weight of the Devourer. The Third Tyrannic War was not a single campaign with a clean beginning, middle, and end. It was a condition, a state of perpetual existential crisis spread across decades and dozens of star systems, fought simultaneously on fronts that never fully connected into a coherent narrative, but instead accumulated into an enormous weight of loss that pressed down on the Imperium in ways that simply cataloguing the battles failed to capture. Inquisitor Krypton, stripped of his rank but not of his purpose or his network of loyal allies, remained the most consistently informed single human being on the subject of Hive Fleet Leviathan's activities. The Carter extremist that had stripped him of his title had also freed him in a certain sense, to cut him loose from the institutional constraints that had occasionally slowed his more extreme decisions and allowed him to operate with the kind of unrestricted pragmatism that the situation, in his assessment, required. He had loyal Death Watch elements who followed his direction regardless of his official status. He had contacts across the Ordo Xenos who continued to feed him data, and he had the relentless, comprehensive attention to detail that had defined his entire career. What the data showed, even with the Octarius diversion successfully disrupting Leviathan's primary axis of advance, was that the Hive Fleet was enormous beyond any prior reckoning. The two tendrils that had constituted the initial attack formed only part of it. Additional tendril formations were being identified in regions the Imperium had not anticipated them, including incursions deep into the Ultima Segmentum and towards sectors the Imperium had never expected to have to defend against Tyranid attack. Each new discovery added to the picture of a hive fleet whose size had been underestimated even by Krypton's already alarming projections. The Tau had their own engagement with Leviathan to deal with, a bitter irony for a species that had only recently survived Hive Fleet Gorgon. Elements of Leviathan were moving toward the Damocles Gulf, the stretch of space between the Tau Empire and the Imperium, and the Tau military found itself in familiar nightmarish territory. facing organisms that remembered the lessons of Gorgon's adaptation and had incorporated them into a new generation of bioforms that were already compensating for the defenses that had been effective last time. The Tau fought as they lost worlds. They survived, though the cost was not small. Imperial Guard Army Group 12, comprised primarily of Katashan and Jornian troops, fought a sustained holding action against one of Leviathan's tendrils that lasted from 997 to Montsom Somsem Tiskashayam 40 Shun and was still ongoing in some form, even as events elsewhere in the war reached their crisis points. 24 Space Marine chapters were engaged in containment operations across the various front lines. Their forces stretched across a region of space so large that coordinating them was itself a logistical challenge of terrifying complexity. The Death Watch conducted operations on dozens of worlds simultaneously, targeting Norn Queens and synapse clusters wherever they could be identified and reached. Among the significant battles of this period was the contest for the world of Sondheim 5. What in most contexts a battle for a single world would be a footnote. The situation on Sondheim 5 was unusual enough to merit description. The planet had already been transformed by the Daemon Makar, the Reborn, into what the records describe as a private pandemonium, a world converted into a manifestation of chaos energy. When Leviathan's tendril reached Sondheim 5, it encountered not the usual Imperial resistance, but a world already in the grip of demonic infestation. What followed was a three-way engagement between the Tyranids, the forces of chaos, and the Sky Sentinels Space Marine chapter dispatched to reclaim the world for the Imperium. The Space Marines looked at the situation, made their assessment, and called for exterminatus. The planet was destroyed from orbit. As is sometimes the most tactically sound decision, is the one that removes the problem entirely, along with the world the problem is happening on. There were moments of individual heroism and tactical ingenuity scattered through the Third Tyrannic War that the records preserve. Captain Cato Sicarius of the Ultramarines arrived at the world of Gorgo just as the last living things on its surface were being absorbed by the Tyranid swarms. He launched what the records call the Spear of Sicarius formation, a coordinated strike specifically targeting the synapse creatures that maintained the hive mind's control on the surface, disrupting the swarm's coherence and buying time. Gorgo was effectively already lost, but the engagement produced valuable data, and more practically, slowed the consumption enough that some evacuation was possible. Or as the war ground on, a pattern emerged that was becoming increasingly apparent to anyone studying the campaign as a whole. Leviathan was enormous. Its tendrils, even the ones that had been disrupted or diverted or damaged, continued their advance. Krypton's cordon of abandoned and sterilized worlds had slowed the advance in places, the hive fleet consuming less biomass from those regions and therefore growing more slowly along those vectors. But the sheer scale of the fleet meant that there was no single strategy capable of stopping it everywhere simultaneously. The Imperium was buying time. It was buying it at enormous cost in lives and worlds, and the irreplaceable genetic heritage of populations that had lived somewhere for centuries and were now simply gone. And it was not clear that even all of that buying was purchasing enough time. The fate of the Forge World Griffon 4 had demonstrated what happened when the Imperium refused to abandon a world that Leviathan's calculations had already marked for consumption. The fate of countless other worlds demonstrated what happened when it did. There were no good choices. There were only choices with different kinds of cost, and Krypton had been making those choices alone for years. Stripped of official sanction, sustained only by the absolute certainty that someone had to keep making them. The Octarius War was buying the Imperium time, but intelligence from the edges of that conflict, such as it was given how difficult communication was in a region that deep in Leviathan's shadow in the warp, was not reassuring. Should both sides were growing stronger. The Tyranids emerging from Octarius engagements were being reported by nearby worlds as larger than any prior specimens, their bioforms showing characteristics that resembled orcish physiology in subtle but unmistakable ways. Organisms that had been bred in the brutal proving ground of sustained combat, against the most fundamentally resilient fighting species in the galaxy, were being refined by that experience in exactly the ways Krypton had feared. If the Tyranids eventually won Octarius, what emerged would be something unprecedented. What Krypton could not have calculated, what no one could have, was the intervention that was coming from outside the material universe entirely. Part 10. The devastation of Bel, blood, demons, and the Great Rift. To understand the devastation of Bel, would you have to understand what Baal meant? Not strategically, though Baal's strategic significance was real, but in the mythic and symbolic sense that matters in the story of the 41st millennium. Baal was the homeworld of the Blood Angels chapter, one of the first founding chapters whose genetic lineage went directly back to Sanguinius, one of the Emperor's Primarchs, one of those demigod figures from the earliest days of the Imperium, whose deaths and deeds had shaped the human civilization that came after. The Blood Angels carried the genetic legacy of Sanguinius in their every cell, including the Black Rage. That terrible psychic wound passed through the gene seed of Sanguinius from the moment of his death at the hands of Horus. It made them more powerful and more unpredictable than other Space Marines. Were warriors who fought with the ferocity of men, already mourning a death they were reliving at the cellular level with every battle. Baal and its two moons, Baal Primus and Baal Secundus, were toxic wastelands by the standards of most habitable worlds. Ancient wars had reduced them to environments that normal humans could barely survive. The soil saturated with radiation, the ecosystem stripped down to only the most tenacious organisms. But they were the Blood Angels' home. They had been the Blood Angels' home for 10,000 years. The fortress monastery Arx Angelicum on Baal was one of the most ancient and sacred structures in the Imperium, a place of pilgrimage and reverence that connected the living chapter to the mythic past of their Primarch. When Hive Fleet Leviathan turned a tendril toward Baal, and it was identifying a target that combined significant biomass concentration with the strategic value of eliminating one of the Imperium's most potent and symbolically important military forces. The Cryptus campaign, fought in 998 Emshon 41, as the Blood Angels and their successor chapters fought to hold a series of shield worlds that stood between Leviathan and Baal itself, was a holding action of extraordinary scale and cost. The shield worlds fell. They fell one after another despite everything the sons of Sanguinius could bring against them, and with each falling, Leviathan's main tendril moved closer. Commander Dante, Lord of the Blood Angels, Chapter Master, and one of the oldest Space Marine commanders in the Imperium, was the anchor of Baal's defense. Dante was extraordinary even by Space Marine standards. His age measured in centuries rather than decades. His face hidden behind the death mask of Sanguinius, worn as both a talisman and a commemoration of the Primarch whose heritage he carried. He understood, with complete clarity, what he was facing and what his options were. The tendril advancing on Baal was enormous. After its losses at Cryptus, it was still enormous. After the preemptive strikes Dante launched, sending elements of his fleet to intercept and whittle down the bioship formations before they could consolidate, it was still enormous. By the time the main Tyranid fleet reached the Baal system, its numbers were such that even looking up through the atmosphere of Baal, the stars had been blotted out, not dimmed, not reduced, blotted out entirely. The sky was Tyranids. As Dante recalled every Space Marine of the Blood Angels lineage he could reach, the gathering that assembled at Baal was described as the largest concentration of the sons of Sanguinius since the Horus heresy itself. A reunion that was also a last stand. Successor chapters arrived, the flesh-tearers, under the tempestuous Gabriel Seth, whose own nature made every deployment with other forces an exercise in careful management. The Blood Drinkers, the Carmine Blades, the Knights of Blood, an excommunicated successor chapter that had been declared renegade, who came anyway because whatever sins the Inquisition had charged them with, they were still sons of Sanguinius and their home was under threat. Dante accepted them. When everything is at stake, genealogy matters more than paperwork. And nearly 30,000 Space Marines gathered at Baal and its moons. the most powerful gathering of superhuman soldiers the Blood Angels' bloodline had seen in 10 millennia, and still not enough. Not remotely enough. The first 19 waves of Tyranid assault were driven back, each one larger than the last. 5 chapter masters died in the fighting before the 20th wave, and by the count of casualties that was accumulating like water rising in a sealed room, the defenders were running out of time and strength faster than the Tyranids were running out of waves. The Swarmlord arrived on Baal's surface. The Swarmlord's presence changed the battle's character immediately, in the way it always did, at the hive mind's most direct instrument, bringing strategic intelligence to bear on a fight that had been going on long enough for the Tyranids to have identified every defensive pattern and prepared specific responses. It turned the tide. The defenders began to falter in ways they had not faltered in the prior waves. Dante faced the Swarmlord himself, exhausted, wounded, the weight of every death he had witnessed pressing down alongside the physical toll of sustained combat. He killed it. Dante, reaching the absolute limit of what any being could endure, slew the Swarmlord in single combat. And then the Great Rift opened. The Cicatrix Maledictum, the wound of the world, the Great Rift. Whatever name you give to the catastrophic tear in reality that split the galaxy in two in 999 M41, this was the consequence of Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade, successfully destroying the fortress world of Cadia, and the subsequent collapse of the psychic barriers that had contained the energies of the Eye of Terror for 10,000 years. The resulting explosion of warp energy tore across the galaxy, creating a permanent rift through which the warp's energies poured into real space in quantities and with an intensity that had not been seen since the fall of the Aeldari in the ancient past. Entire star systems vanished into the rift. Others found themselves bathed in perpetual warp stormlight, reality fraying at the edges, demons manifesting as naturally as weather. At Baal, the opening of the Great Rift did several things simultaneously and in rapid sequence. As the warp storms that burst outward from the rift reached the Baal system and played havoc with everything there. Millions of Tyranid organisms, cut off from the hive mind's guidance by the interference of the warp storms, lost coherence, reverted to animal behavior, began to tear at each other and at themselves in the mindless frenzy that disconnected Tyranids exhibited. The shadow in the warp that Leviathan had maintained over the system was disrupted, fractured, unable to sustain the level of synaptic control the swarm required to fight as a unified entity. The enormous bioship formations in orbit were caught in the same disruption, the living vessels losing the coordination that had made them so effective as a fleet and becoming instead individual organisms disoriented by the sudden interference. It was not a salvation, not alone. Yet the warp storms were also killing Blood Angels, driving those with the Black Rage into its terminal manifestation, taking every astropath on the planet insane or dead, preventing any hope of communication or reinforcement. Baal Prime was about to be overwhelmed. The defenders there were being killed not just by Tyranids, but by the warp energies themselves, the raw chaos power flooding in through the opened rift, tearing at souls as well as bodies. And then Ka'Bandha came. Ka'Bandha is a bloodthirster, a greater demon of Khorne, the chaos god of blood and warfare. He is ancient and enormously powerful, one of the most feared of all Khornate servants, and he has a specific and deeply personal connection to the Blood Angels that goes back to the Horus Heresy. When he had broken the Blood Angels' advance on Cygnus Prime and had faced Sanguinius himself, he had been waiting, across 10,000 years, for the opportunity to be the one who finally destroyed the sons of his hated enemy. That the Blood Angels would not die by any other hands but his was something Ka'Bandha had decided with the absolute conviction of a being whose entire existence was war and blood, and the hierarchies of who had the right to what kills. He arrived at Baal Prime at the head of a massive Khornate demonic host, manifesting through the opened rift, and he declared, in words that the Blood Angels who survived to report them found deeply unnerving, that none would have the right to destroy his hated foes but him. Then Ka'Bandha, and the demons of Khorne fought the Tyranids. From the specifics of that battle are almost impossible to document with precision. Demonic forces are not orderly, they do not file battle reports, and the Blood Angels still alive on Baal Prime were in no position to take accurate notes. What is known is that the demons tore through the Tyranid organisms on Baal Prime with a ferocity that matched or exceeded anything the Great Devourer had thrown at the planet. Khornate demons neither feared nor were harmed by Tyranid biology in the ways that biological organisms were, and the Tyranids could not eat them in the sense they could eat anything with physical mass, because demons are not physical. The contest was unequal in the Tyranids' disfavour for once. On Baal proper, the disruption of the hive mind's control, combined with the gradual breakdown of the bioship formation, gave the remaining defenders a breathing space they had not had for days. They used it, they pushed, they fought with the desperate efficiency of people who had nothing left to save except each other and the walls of their fortress monastery and the memory of their Primarch. Then Reboot Guilliman arrived. The Indomitus Crusade, the massive military expedition launched by the resurrected Primarch Reboot Guilliman to restore order to an Imperium fractured by the events of the Great Rift, reached the Baal system at the moment of its greatest need. Guilliman had not planned this. He had not known, specifically, what was happening at Baal any more than he could know what was happening at every critical point in an empire of 1,000,000 worlds simultaneously. He arrived because the Crusade's route had brought it to this region, and the people receiving it were in no position to wonder about timing when the alternative was being consumed. The Indomitus Crusade's fleet was an enormous force, purpose-built for the kind of campaign that the fractured post-Great Rift Imperium required, carrying not just Space Marine forces, but the Primaris Space Marines, the new form of the Adeptus Astartes that had been developed over a century in secret and were now being deployed for the first time in significant numbers. The Ultramarines, the Dark Angels, dozens of chapters receiving their first infusions of Primaris warriors. All of them arriving at Baal alongside Guilliman himself. They cleared the system. The Tyranid bioships, already disrupted and disoriented by the warp storms, were hunted down by a fleet that was fresh, coordinated, and led by a Primarch. The organisms on the surface, already fighting without full coherence, were systematically destroyed. Baal was liberated. When the last Tyranid on Baal Prime was killed, what remained there in the silence was not what anyone expected. No bones of defenders, no ruins, no debris from the battle. On Baal Prime's southern hemisphere, an enormous structure had been built from the skulls of Tyranid organisms, piled impossibly high into the shape of an 8-pillared sigil that the Blood Angels recognized immediately and with deep dread. The symbol of Karbanda, the symbol he had left behind, constructed from hundreds of millions of dead Tyranids, a monument both to his victory and his declaration that the Blood Angels were his to destroy eventually, his gift to his enemies, his promise that he would be back. Karbanda and his demons were gone, back through the rift, leaving behind only the mountain of alien skulls and the question of what that encounter meant. The scholars of the Ordo Xenos would spend years analysing it. What they were able to determine was that Hive Fleet Leviathan's main concentration, the tendril that had been closing on Baal, was largely destroyed, not by the Imperium's defenders, not by Guilliman's arrival, but by the opening of the Great Rift and what had come through it. Hundreds of thousands of bioships simply ceased to exist as the warp storms tore through them. The hive mind's coherence in this region was shattered in a way that had no prior precedent. Leviathan was, for the first time in the Third Tyrannic War, genuinely broken in a meaningful section of its body. The Blood Angels rebuilt. Guilliman oversaw the process with the efficiency of a Primarch, the Primaris Space Marines bolstering a chapter that had lost enormous numbers in the siege, the fortress monastery Arx Angelicum repaired, the chapter house restored. The Blood Angels and their successor chapters set out from Baal renewed, albeit scarred, and began the campaign that the records call the Red Scar, pushing through the surrounding region to purge whatever Tyranid presence remained of Leviathan's scattered remnants. The Third Tyrannic War had ended, or more accurately, it had transformed into something new. As Part 11, the Fourth Tyrannic War. The Great Devourer adapts. The galaxy that emerged from the opening of the Great Rift was not the galaxy that had existed before it. The Cicatrix Maledictum split the known universe in two, the Imperium Sanctus on one side, the Imperium Nihilus on the other, separated by a storm of warp energy so intense and so permanent that navigation across it required either extraordinary skill, extraordinary luck, or both. Reboot Gilliman's Indomitus Crusade moved through the Imperium Sanctus, attending to the most critical crises one after another. The resources of the Imperium that had once been notionally available everywhere were now effectively divided, the half of the Empire in permanent warp shadow, having to manage its own problems with far less support than it had historically relied upon. Were in that fractured, storm-haunted post-Rift galaxy, the Hive fleet Leviathan had been broken but not ended. The Tyranid hive mind does not die from having a part of it destroyed. It adapts. It processes the loss of those tendrils, the death of those organisms, the disruption of those synaptic networks, the way a body processes a wound, not as a fundamental ending, but as data to be incorporated into what comes next. The Tyranid organisms expelled back into real space by the warp storms, the splinter fleets that had escaped the destruction at Baal and elsewhere, the remnants that had been feeding on the margins of Octarius, all of these continue to consume, to breed, to evolve. And the Octarius War eventually produced a victor. The fighting in that dense cluster of systems had been ongoing for decades, both sides growing stronger through sustained conflict in ways that horrified the strategic analysts, who were monitoring it from a safe distance. When the Tyranids finally achieved dominance in Octarius, what they brought away from that extended campaign was the biological inheritance of billions of Orc engagements, their organisms refined and strengthened by the most intensive gauntlet of violence that any species in the galaxy had run. The new Tyranid strains that emerged from Octarius were noted by surviving Imperial observers to be physically larger than prior specimens, more resilient, incorporating biological adaptations that had no prior equivalent in Tyranid taxonomy. With these refined organisms and the experience of 3 full Tyrannic wars incorporated into its evolving genetic library, the hive mind made a decision that the Imperium, absorbed in the management of the post-Great Rift crisis, was not prepared for. Leviathan returned, not to the eastern fringe, where the Imperium's defences were strongest, and where the memory of 3 wars had concentrated the most specialised anti-Tyranid military capability, not from below the galactic plane this time, at least not at first. Leviathan's new offensive struck at the western reaches of the Segmentum Pacificus. Segmentum Pacificus was the western edge of the Imperium, an enormous section of the galaxy that had historically faced fewer of the extreme Xenos threats that dominated Imperial military thinking. The great threats of the age of the Imperium, the Orc invasions, the Chaos incursions, the Tyranid wars, had all come predominantly from the eastern reaches and the southern fringe. The Segmentum Pacificus was not undefended, but it was defended for a different threat profile. It was not configured for a Tyranid hive fleet, and the hive fleet knew this, or rather the hive mind knew it, processing the data of 3 prior conflicts and understanding that the Imperium's most hardened defences were elsewhere. The first indication was, as always, silence. Systems in the far west of the Segmentum Pacificus simply stopped communicating. The shadow in the warp descended over an arc of space wider than most of the prior Tyranid incursions had covered, and the bureaucratic machinery of the Imperium was slow to interpret it as Tyranid activity, rather than the kind of warp storm interference that was now common in the post-Great Rift galaxy. By the time the Morpheum Sector Command identified the pattern correctly, the high astropath Giddoth's death having finally transmitted enough data in its psychic death echo to make the picture clear, 6 sectors in the Segmentum Pacificus had already been consumed. 2 enormous tendrils drove upward through the galactic plane from below, their trajectories parallel, named Nautilon in the Asmodeox sector and Promethor in the Morphium sector. The direction of their advance aimed them at the Segmentum Solar, at Terra. With Guilliman and the bulk of the Indomitus Crusade's most elite forces committed to engagements in the Segmentum Solar and Segmentum Ultima, the Western Front was short on exactly the kind of concentrated expert military force it needed. The response that was assembled reflected this constraint. Or rather than mass armies and consolidated battle groups, the Imperium deployed the Soulblades. A Soulblade was a rapid response strike force, small in absolute numbers but extraordinarily capable, drawing on the most elite forces available: Space Marines, Sisters of Battle, Militarum Tempestus Scions, Knight Households, Adeptus Mechanicus Scitarii, and in a deployment of forces usually reserved for threats at Terra itself, elements of the Adeptus Custodes, those golden warriors who served as the Emperor's own guard. Even the Silent Sisterhood, those null maidens whose psychic blankness was anathema to any psychic entity and profoundly disruptive to the hive mind's synaptic connections, were deployed. The Soulblades were not large enough to stop the Tyranid advance in the conventional sense. They were designed to disrupt, to delay, or to strike at key organisms and bioship concentrations, to identify the patterns in the Tyranid advance and exploit whatever tactical opportunities presented themselves. Lord Solar Arcadian Leontus, commander of the Imperial Guard forces assembled for this campaign, and Captain General Trajan Valoris of the Adeptus Custodes, coordinated the broader strategic response. The policy of aggressive defense was formulated: fortify the worlds that could serve as anchor points, strike hard at Leviathan's tendrils where they could be reached, buy time for larger forces to be assembled while accepting the loss of worlds that could not be held. Among the most significant early engagements of the Fourth Tyrannic War were the battles for the Formidae system in the Bastia subsector. The Formidae system contained two worlds of importance: Ogram, a hive world of considerable population and industrial output, and Sanctum, the chapter planet of the White Templars' Space Marine chapter. Ogram was the first major test of the Imperium's new defensive posture, a world whose population numbered in the billions, a target so rich in biomass that it drew a full tendril of Leviathan's attention with focused purpose. The fighting on Ogram was fierce and terrible. Space Marines launched vicious counter-offensives, driving back the Tyranid's spore fall in localized areas and attempting to hold the critical infrastructure of a planet under total assault. For a time, the outcome was balanced on an edge, the possibility of holding briefly real, but the numbers were simply too great. As the tendril that had targeted Ogram brought organisms in quantities that the defenders could not match, and the hive mind adapted to each defensive arrangement with the exhausting speed that it always brought to combat. Ogram fell. Its billions of people were consumed. The world that had been alive with industry and human presence became another barren rock in a slowly growing trail of them. The Bastia subsector's defense became a critical test case for the Soulblade concept. The Ultramarines' second company, under the command of Captain Sevastus Acheron, conducted operations in the Residius system within the Bastia theatre, and those operations produced one of the stranger stories of the Fourth Tyrannic War. In the process of campaigning through the devastated systems, Henrikaran's force recovered a veteran warrior who had been lost to the chapter for many years. The warrior was named Demetrian Titus, a name from an earlier chapter of Ultramarine history, recovered alive from circumstances that the records are incomplete on. His return to the chapter was one of those small human stories that sometimes surface from the grinding machinery of a war of this scale. Sanctum, the White Templars' chapter planet, was the location of a more successful defensive engagement. The tendril designated Grandillus, the third major offensive arm of Leviathan's assault into the Bastia subsector, drove against Sanctum with a force that threatened to do to the White Templars what Kraken had done to the scythes of the Emperor. It did not succeed. Sanctum's fortress monastery, called Holdfast, which was defended by the White Templars and by Lord Solar Leontus himself, whose command of the broader defensive operation brought Imperial Guard resources to support what would otherwise have been a purely Space Marine engagement. Chapter Master Cruxor Stavro held the walls while Leontus directed the broad attack.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.